All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Rosie, and I work with Chelsea Green Publishing in the UK, and we're an independent employee-owned publisher. We have offices in the US and the UK. And I'm so excited to introduce our speakers this evening, two of which are our very own authors. But before I get started, just want to remind people to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So please enter in your questions. If you want to chat, tell us where you're listening in from, use the chat box, and we'll get to questions in about the last 10 minutes of the evening. The event is also being recorded, so if you have to step out and miss part of it, we'll have it on our YouTube channel in a few days. So I'm thrilled to introduce Sue, who I can't think of a better person to lead this conversation. She is the CEO of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. And she also has a small farm in Wales. So she knows the practicalities and she knows the policies. So thank you, Sue, and I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Rosie. And I'm incredibly excited to be able to host this conversation here this evening. As Rosie said, I feel like I'm the centre of the Venn between the two of you, living as I do here on a small farm in Wales, and so I've got a huge personal interest in your work as well as a professional interest, and I have a whole pile of questions that I want to explore with both of you this evening. But before I get into that, why don't you two introduce yourselves and your books? Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. My name's Chris Smaje. I've just produced this book, A Small Farm Future. I mean, in a former life, I was a university-based social scientist, but for the last 20 odd years, I've run a small farm, small holding here in Somerset, in southwest England. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Chris. Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Davidson, and I live on a small holding in Wales, 10 acres, 6 acres of woodland, but we don't sell, we do it for ourselves because we're trying to see how we can manage livestock and grow fruit and vegetables in terms of feeding our family. And I've written a book, Futuregen, and you're now surrounded on my screen by pictures of Futuregen. And it's the story about how Wales has become the first country in the world to adopt legislation to protect future generations. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Thank you both. So let's start out with thinking about that notion of small. About nearly 20 years ago now, 15 years ago, in a previous life, I worked with Welsh Government on a project called Small Country Governance. It was just post devolution, when Wales was taking on many more responsibilities for its own governance from the UK. And one of the questions that people would say over and over again at that time was, Wales is too small. Wales is too small a country to govern itself well. And as an antidote to that, and working with public sector leaders, we created a kind of learning set between Wales and Denmark, where people from Wales visited their counterparts, public sector leaders in Denmark, as another small country which had been very successfully governing itself for nearly 900 years. So we felt they're probably making a reasonably decent fist of it. But it struck me then, as it strikes me now, that we are reclaiming the notion of small, both the prospects and opportunities for small countries to shape their own destiny in really quite interesting and radical ways. And you, Chris, reclaiming the power and potential of the small farm, which has frankly been at best overlooked and at worst really quite rubbished in farm policy over the last 50 years or so. What made you, let me start with you, Chris, what made you want to reclaim the small farm in your story?
Yeah, well, I suppose, I mean, it's interesting, you know, you framed it in a fascinating way, both in terms of kind of small politics and small farming. I mean, I think so much of the world that we have become accustomed to, you know, over our lifetimes is based on cheap fossil energy that kind of disintegrates local connections and connects us up with, you know, much bigger sort of economic flows and political flows. And of course, historically, you know, we've got into this whole notion of politics about being nation states, you know, having to be kind of have some kind of centralized political authority that's orchestrating everything from the center. And, you know, I think in so many ways, these things are being upended, you know, in terms of climate change, in terms of energy futures, where I think, you know, certainly in the rich countries, we're just not going to have the level of energy availability that we've been used to. And politically, I think the narrative of the single centralized nation state is fraying. So all of these things are pointing to you know, a more sort of supple local interactions, and that raises its own difficulties. But, you know, certainly one thing about small farming is that I think, you know, in the future we're going to need more people working in low carbon labor intensive sectors. When we were chatting earlier, you mentioned Tim Jackson's work, and, you know, that's been very much one of his mantras. But farming is, you know, is clearly going to be a key labor intensive and potentially low carbon sector. But also politically, you know, I think we're going to need to rethink sort of how we organize ourselves at those local levels. And in terms of small farming, you know, one of the advantages of it is that it gives us immediate feedback. You know, one of the problems in the world is that, you know, we buy stuff from goodness knows where, we have no idea sort of where it's come from or the conditions in which it's been produced, and we sort of lose control of our own grounding in the ecological base. So to my mind, you know, a really key thing about small scale farming and also small polities is that, you know, we're getting immediate feedback. We sort of know the consequences of our actions and can adjust accordingly.
Brilliant, brilliant. And Jane, you were, you know, as a minister in the Welsh government in those early days, you really grasped the opportunity to reshape political thinking in the Future Generations Act. Tell me a bit more about what it was that really motivated you to take on such a bold challenge.
Well, thanks, Sue. And I think that a lot of people on the call will know that you might be the person who in a sense jumped the final hurdle, but there's always lots of other actions that happen behind it. And in the case of Wales, there was a duty given to the new National Assembly for Wales in 1999 for it to promote sustainable development in everything that it did. And it turned out over a period of about 10 years to find that was really hard to do. It was really hard to do because nobody had defined sustainable development and nobody had defined what the duty to promote was. And therefore, although there were, you know, some really interesting schemes, and there were a lot of people very, very behind this principle, because it had come from civil society, the whole idea in the first place of this new legislature being much more sustainable than had historically been the case in the UK. Because people didn't really know what it meant that when I took on the ministerial responsibility to deliver on this, I was faced with a real challenge. You know, were we going to try and do something that covered everything the government did, which was my big ambition? And if so, how could we make it something that people understood? So the proposal that I came forward with at the time and was agreed by the politicians was that sustainable development would be the central organizing principle of government. Now, that was so unusual in the political system, and we got support for it, political support. 2/3 strongly supported it. But what also became quite clear within a year was that actually nothing changed. So there was this big political vision, but it wasn't generating any action. And then when I found out from the Wales Audit Office, which is how governments are accountable in the UK, is through the Audit Office, that actually we'd never failed on a duty to promote sustainable development, even though I knew we weren't delivering it, I knew we had to do something. And that's when I kind of like thought, right, okay, we're going to have a law that means we deliver, not promote. We're going to have an independent commissioner to hold people to account. We're going to have to make the government accountable to the law as well. And that, for anybody on the call, is very, very unusual. Governments normally make laws for other people. They don't make laws to catch themselves. But I was insistent that we had to have that. And it had to apply to all the public services that Wales was responsible for. And it was just the time was right for that. So when I proposed it, I also left government because I wanted to come and live and farm my little farm. And I believe very, very strongly that politicians should only stay in politics for a relatively short period of time, particularly in a small country, so that there can be turnover, so that people can move in and out of jobs and politics. And therefore, the people of Wales own the outcomes rather than a small number of politicians. And as you know, and I can't say how delighted I am that I left it in the prospectus for the next government, and the next government and the next National Assembly took it through. So I pay huge tribute to those people who wanted a different values framework and were prepared to adopt what I proposed to make a different values framework for Wales. And I think we could only do it because we're a small country, for all the reasons that you've identified, because you can get all the local authority leaders in a room, because you can get all the politicians in a room, because every single person in Wales will run into their local politicians, their local authority leaders, their health professionals in a shop or in a market or whatever. So we're connected. And probably for people on the call, I should say, we're 3 million people and 10 million sheep. So the sheep at the edge by a considerable amount.
And I've got 100 of them on my farm here, at least when I last looked. They're notorious for keeling over, aren't they, sheep? Let's stick with this theme, because you pick this up a lot in your work, Chris. The theme of, as you call it, localisms, and the different way of understanding how we can devolve power, responsibility, accountabilities to local levels, and what it means when we start thinking about, as you describe it, self-provisioning for communities. What was it about that trajectory, that direction of travel that caught you and made it such a central organising theme for your book?
Well, I think, partly the self-provisioning thing is, goes back to what I was saying about the sort of ecological feedback, and, we need to create societies and farm systems that are closer to the ecological base. I mean, the problem that I sort of wrestled with in the book is, I think, there are so many things that are potentially going to upend our world, it's kind of hard to see. Well, I mean, actually, it was really interesting hearing Jane talking, because I was going to ask, part of what I think what emerged reading your book was that there's some kind of political continuity in Wales, whereas, if we think about the recent US election, for example, there's this kind of ping pong between the Democrats and the Republicans, and to the extent that almost the political conversation has broken down between them. So I think, one aspect of it is the size of the country, but it's also, I'd be interested to hear more from you about the kind of links between government and civil society, because, that seems really key. But I guess, I didn't really go in the book in detail into specific places. It was a more generic sort of argument that I think centralized government generally, if we're thinking about sort of Westminster or Washington, DC, I think is going to have more and more on its plate, and is going to be less and less. It's probably going to be demanding more of people and giving less to people. The kind of services that we take for granted from government, it's going to be, more and more threadbare. And in that situation, people, I think that's where civil society and what's great about your work is the way that, it's not just a sort of top-down government initiative. It's kind of creating community enablement. And that seems to be really key. We have to create community enablement, and we have to not be romantic about that, in the sense that, you know, that it's going to be tough. There's going to be tough conversations and sort of differences. I mean, I draw on, you know, Rebecca Solnit has written this this book where she talks about a paradise built in hell, and it's partly as so much of our world is upended. You know, the most optimistic scenario I can think of is that people are gonna, you know, it's going to be in their interest, and they're going to have to sit down and work these things out together, and that's the opportunity, I think, for local renewal. But, you know, nothing is, you know, I'm not saying that that's going to be easy or is going to work out well everywhere, but I think, you know, that's what we've got to try and focus on to deliver a you know, a good small farm future rather than a bad one.
Yeah. I mean, we have, I think, as you were mentioning, Chris, in my work in the Food Farming Countryside Commission, we have a whole strand of work that's called resourcing more resilient and adaptive communities, and we've got a whole bunch of, you know, quite practical stuff in that. But actually, the reason that we have that as a strand of work is because it was my kind of antidote to my own anxiety. You know, being an old woman and having done this work for, you know, well over 30 years now, you kind of see campaigns foundering, or political initiatives falling apart, or governments changing and directions changing really rapidly. But I was absolutely convinced, and remain absolutely convinced, that if you can work with people in their communities, that is where we all end up. You know, at points of crisis, we all end up back where we live, in our communities. And it's there where we have to work through those really foundational issues that are fundamental to our lives. And I think, you know, we've just experienced that, haven't we, in the last 9-10 months now of the coronavirus crisis in the UK, when our first lockdown started back in March. People suddenly realised that place matters and community matters, and how we look after ourselves and each other really matters in an incredibly material and not abstracted way at all. So in a way, we've, you know, the silver lining to this really difficult episode that we're still working through is it gives us a dress rehearsal, doesn't it? It gives us a taste of the even bigger issues that we are going to have to respond to pretty soon. Well, right now, the issue of climate breakdown, of the nature crisis, of the kind of social disruption that people are experiencing in countries all around the world as a result of those big global phenomena. So it feels to me as if, you know, the conditions that are being created around us are, you know, the universe is very generously pointing us to the sorts of questions that I think you're both answering. Jane, in your work, thinking what are the policy conditions that governments have to create to enable communities to become more resilient and more adaptive to whatever scenario will unfold in the future. And Chris, you're giving us a really well argued and grounded sense of what that's going to have to look like in a really practical way if we're going to look after our communities' really basic needs. I mean, I don't think that's being too grandiose, do you?
No, I mean, COVID has been horrendous, but, you know, certainly when it hit and the supermarket shelves, you know, quite quickly emptied particularly of fresh produce. And, you know, we have a little local veg box scheme, you know, where we grow and sell vegetables, mostly a bit of fruit as well locally. And, you know, all of a sudden, you know, normally we get a few new customer queries a week, and all of a sudden we were getting several hundred. And, you know, we did our best to expand production and to prioritize people in need. But I think, you know, hopefully we can treat it as a wake-up call to the sort of work that matters, because, you know, farming is you know, I mean, you know, it's this sort of ironic thing about farming is that it's absolutely at the base of every society. I mean, you know, there's over 7 billion of us on the planet, and we're only here because we've figured out farming systems that sustain us. And yet, and okay, at times of war, or maybe something like COVID, the government sort of tends to farming, yeah, we better think about that. But generally, farming is the sort of substrate that doesn't get attention, and then all of a sudden people people suddenly sort of start thinking about food. And of course people started growing their own food, which which is great. Gardening. I mean, I think to some extent we need to break down this sort of rather artificial distinction between we tend to think of farmers as it's large scale modern commercial farming is quite remote from most people's experience, but we need to sort of break down these distinctions between commercial large scale farming and people just providing for their needs, self-provisioning, and certainly that was one dimension of COVID. So yeah, I mean, all of these things are going back in the mix, and it's really crucial that we try and hold on to those lessons and think about the kind of work that we need to do locally that sustains us, because we do tend to forget about farming as part of the national conversation.
Yeah, we talked earlier, I'm just going to pick that up, Jane, and talk about access to land, and the other brilliant bit of legislation that you sponsored, One Planet Development. So I guess the elephant in the room underpinning Chris's propositions in his book is that it's very difficult to get access to land, and it's very difficult for young people, particularly without access to capital, to get the land that they want, or anyone without access to capital to come into farming in a way that's meaningful. But you did some really brilliant work in Wales on a scheme called One Planet Development. Do you want to tell people about that?
Well, yes, I think one of the things that became very clear to me when I was the planning minister was that it was very easy to build a concrete bungalow in a village or on the edge of a village, but it was almost impossible to create low carbon housing. And it just struck me that in a world where we are all going to experience, and in fact are experiencing, the impact of climate change, that we also needed a whole load of pioneers who would actually help us look at how we could use land more effectively, and using land in a way that was low carbon. Because Sue, you'll be acutely aware that in Wales there are some real challenges. A lot of the Welsh land is sort of peripheral sheep grazing. There's a lot of nitrates that go into the system. There's a lot of slurry that goes down into rivers. So there are some real challenges here in the nature of a very hilly country. We're good at grass. We're incredibly good at grass, and we're going to have to learn to work with that. But I was therefore really interested to know if people had different ideas whereby they could live zero carbon lives by creating both a zero carbon dwelling and getting half their income off their land, half of average income off their land. So it meant that it was likely that there'd have to be other incomes that would come into the household. But if people were prepared to do that, and they'd be prepared to meet very exacting planning targets, then they would be given agricultural land. They could be sold agricultural land by farmers, get it through the planning system, be very closely monitored, and then if they achieve the right outcomes in 5 years, be able to live and work that holding. And I think, going back to the previous discussion, one of the very important elements in all of this has been not that there has been the same party in control in Wales in the whole period of time since the National Assembly started, but that party has been in partnership with two other parties. And during that period of time, there is a broader set of values that has developed. And what I wanted to do with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is to get a set of values that still enabled people to have their individual political ideologies, but also be able to get behind a set of values that meant that they would be ethical, they would be moral, they would tackle climate, and they would benefit future generations. And of course, what the Future Generations Act does, it actually prohibits high carbon activity. It asks you to focus on equality. It asks you to maintain and enhance biodiversity. And therefore, many of those things that are facing us at the moment, whether it's about Black Lives Matter, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate, the Future Generations Act can help you navigate your way through. And I was particularly interested, for those people on the call from the United States, that I was doing a seminar in Harvard on this, and I was contacted afterwards by a young Republican who said that it was very difficult for them to talk about climate change, but they could talk about future generations. So there's also about how we can find the narratives to take a values framework, such as a Future Generations Act, forward in countries. And One Planet developments is one facet of that, but also the way Chris has described a small farm future would be a logical extension of picking up those One Planet developments and looking what really works in our landscapes, with our land, with our soil, with our geology and everything else, and looking therefore at extending that for the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and part of the, I mean, obviously when future generations, we immediately think of these sort of big crunchy global issues like climate change, but part of it is also you know, finding ways to hand farmland or housing affordably on to young people. I mean, I'm involved in an organisation called the Ecological Land Co-op that tries to create affordable small holdings for people. And you know, it's we talk about One Planet development a lot. You know, we do have holdings in Wales, but mostly in England, where we don't really have that. So the planning regimen is one problem, but also just, you know, the way that land values sort of tend to inflate unless you find you know, political structures to stop that from happening. And I mean, I do touch on it in the book, but, you know, my book isn't really a kind of policy wonkery book about all the minutiae of different sort of taxation structures and so on. But I think we really need to be having this conversation about how to unlock land for future generations and to, you know, to create small farms, but also to, you know, not to burden future generations with sort of impossible debts, which, you know, is happening in all sorts of ways at the moment.
And Chris, I think very importantly in the context of One Planet developments, for people who want to look them up, they're in something called Technical Advisory Note 6 of the Welsh planning system, and it's only there's only two short paragraphs about them, and so it's very easy to look at them going elsewhere. The point is that people buy the land at agricultural prices. And this was very much because, of course, historically, land banks have developed that have made it absolutely impossible for people to buy at the prices that the owners want to sell. And I was really keen that we could bring more young people onto the land, being innovative for a low carbon future. And I think it's very exciting initiatives. And I know there are similar initiatives in both Canada and the United States. And I hope that this is going to really become a kind of worldwide movement of exchanging ways in which we can develop these kinds of opportunities.
And in terms of a just transition from where we are now to where we need to be, there's value in that particular policy development for retiring farmers, because as we know, very, very many older farmers can't bear the thought of giving up farming because it is so embodied in who they are. You talk about this too, Chris. It's not just about what you do, but it's about who you are. It's about your sense of your whole sense of self and your sense of place in your community. So farmers often don't want to leave the farm because they don't know where they'd go. They'd have to go, you know, into a town or into a bungalow, and so the prospects of something like One Planet development being used for low carbon homes for retiring farmers to stay on or near their land, whilst making the rest of the land available for multiple ownership for other younger farmers or younger growers who want to come into the land. You know, it opens up all sorts of possibilities if we are prepared to commit to the idea that a small farm future is as plausible economically, socially, ecologically, as this kind of current drive that everything's got to be bigger to get economies of scale and to consolidate and
Yeah.
intensify.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. There's so many issues wrapped up in that. That all of those issues of inheritance and connection to the land, but also, there's this kind of weird structure in farming where the land value is huge, but the money that you can actually make from farming, or certainly from producing basic food commodities, is so low. And then people get pushed into farm diversification, as it's called, but really the basis of it should be producing food and fiber that's needed in the local economy. So we need to I don't make any great claims to be a politician. I'm sure, Jane's already solved a lot of these issues, I think, but we need to find a way of sort of valuing and honouring land for what it means locally, but also moving people through it, and and incentivising people, to be furnishing the local community mostly with the food and fibre that it needs, rather than trying to find ways to make money to make ends meet. So there's a whole set of quite intractable economic issues there, but it's great that in Wales you're well ahead of us in England, that's for sure. But there's a lot of things to think through, and of course that's all in the context of these bigger looming issues like climate change and energy futures and sort of economic contraction. Yeah, a lot to think about.
But I think I think what you may not be a policy wonk, Chris, but what you do beautifully in the book is introduce some interesting new ideas. You coined some really interesting phrases, and one that I particularly liked was saying, let's give up the notion of consumerism and let's instead start thinking about producerism and valuing the process of production, and particularly the process of producing those things that are absolutely foundational to our needs as human beings. And just thinking about what you were saying earlier, Jane, about finding ways of talking about values that are cross-cutting, that don't necessarily sit in any one kind of political mindset. It struck me that valuing production again and valuing producers again has the capacity to do that.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it touches on what we were talking about earlier in relation to COVID, that I think, people have a real thirst to, to be providing for their needs, to be making things or growing things. And, one of the tragedies, I think, is that we've got into this whole sort of techno-futurist urbanist mindset where, it's better to to be sort of in a kind of high-tech consumerist sort of framing, and I mean that's great maybe for some people, but I'm not sure it's the world that whether we like it or not we're headed into. But I think people want some kind of sense of personal autonomy and personal control, even if it's just growing a few herbs or knowing how to. That's one of the other problems with sort of machinery, where older machinery, it was possible. I sort of just about know how to fix up my old tractor, whereas a modern car, it's sort of completely beyond me. So there's all of these sorts of issues about just people wanting to claim back some autonomy, and I think farming is a really vital way of doing that if we sort of get the policy and the economic framework around it correct.
Yes, I think another very important aspect to that is how we bring people back to the land in the first place. And what I love about your book, Chris, is that you talk in lots of ways about how people can have access to land, whether or not it's through a sort of garden approach or whether or not it's in any size of farm. And it struck me really powerfully that actually the reconnecting people with the land is probably the single most powerful thing that can happen here, because people don't necessarily understand where their meat comes from, where their dairy comes from. We assume they do, but I've been deeply shocked to find young people who have not in any way can connect meat in a plastic wrapper in a supermarket with an animal. So there's something very much about the tractability and the intractability of land as well, so that when you've got to work it, when you've got to work with it. It's pretty unforgiving if you're just trying to work to it. And that sort of separation now, with where farming has become larger and larger tractors. I mean, there's a tractor that goes past us that is bigger than our tractor shed. So the sort of separation by being up higher and mechanized and getting back to actually engaging with the soil. I just feel it's a really powerful message that is sort of sometimes subliminal and sometimes very, very explicit in your book.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, the real problem there is that basically diesel is cheap and human labour is dear. So like anything that you can mechanise and you know, the sort of logical endpoint to that is these enormous tractors, and that, you know, I don't think is going to be a long-term viable solution. So you know, as you say, we need to get people back onto the land, and you know, I guess people are connecting more, you know, with food and cooking, you know, the Great British Bake Off or whatever, and people are connecting with a kind of wildlife and biodiversity agenda, but not so much, I think, with farming. And you know, we've really got to bring, you know, food, farming, wildlife, land, you know, we've got to bring all of those things together, and yeah, I mean, acknowledge that it's not, you know, farming is, you know, it is hard work, but you know, people are quite prepared to work hard at other things. You know, we need to, again, it's about creating the economic and the social framework around it to support farming, rather than to, you know, to make it this thankless task, you know, of low paid, long hours and all the rest of it. So I think, you know, some of the other stuff, the food and the biodiversity stuff has moved forwards, and you know, it's time now, I guess, all of us involved in this in one way or another, you know, we've got to sort of change the narrative about farming a little bit and make it a bit more nuanced than this idea of, you know, big tractors and high tech being the, you know, the only way forwards.
Let's talk a little bit more about this, because I think this is a really important part of the narrative about what good work looks like, not just at the moment, but the good work that we need for the future, and the good work that future generations will need to do to restore and recover the planet. I've been amused, but also extremely frustrated that the most precarious, the most poorly paid, the most undervalued work in society at the moment has somehow been reshaped and called the gig economy, as if giving it a kind of funky name somehow honours it or gives it a status that frankly it does not deserve, because it is the most debasing work of all. And it's very often done in the food system. It's very often done in packing, in processing, in shop work, in hospitality, where and you know, even the biggest supermarkets continue to have, you know, short part-time or 0 hours contracts, which gives them an enormous amount of control over their cash flow, but places all the risk on the poorest and most vulnerable members of a community. And yet it's so-called peasant work or farm work that's called problematic or hard or somehow not valuable. Now that, you know, I'm even as I describe that in this conversation right now, I'm both astonished and enraged by it, because it's a real corruption of what matters and what's important. And yet we've been seduced in thinking that somehow the techno fix over there is going to save us, and that kind of work is funky, whereas the really important, you know, provisioning work for all of our really basic needs has become devalued. How can we recreate, how can we upend that narrative and transform it into one that values the really important work that we've been talking about here?
Well, can I start, Sue, with the overarching stuff? Because one of the things that I'm most excited about in the context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is it has redefined prosperity in Wales. It defines it as innovative, productive and low carbon, recognising the limits of the global environment acting on climate change, developing a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. Now, that word decent work in that context is critically important for what you're saying. And I think that we actually need the political recognition that decent work is what we have to offer current and future generations. And what really excites me is it was people of all parties who decided to put that definition into law in Wales. I mean, clearly it'll be tested through the courts at some course, but I think it would be impossible to say that producers who are not paid for their produce, or people in the gig economy who are given 0 hours contract, that cannot constitute decent work. So a values framework that lifts the parameters, I think, is very helpful here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I think we were saying earlier, you know, there is this kind of long historical memory of what lack of autonomy, you know, the kind of class structure of a peasant society with you know, the mass of cultivators sort of under the thumb of the ruling class. I mean, I think you know, one thing I try and do in the book is recover. I mean, the term that is used is agrarian populism, and you know, populism is, you know, like all of these political words can mean so many different things, not all of them very good, but you know, but I think, you know, there is a long history of cultivators, peasants seeking autonomy, which I sort of try and draw on a little bit in the book. But I think, you know, historically in Britain, because we urbanized so early, you know, so many working people moved to the cities, and the sort of theatre of their food activism became urban. So you get the whole kind of allotment movement and so on. But I think, you know, we need to be putting that back into rural contexts. And it is difficult. I mean, I think it is changing, because a lot of young people now, you know, the sort of traditional notion of a, you know, of a long steady career and, you know, buying a house and so on is changing. And so, I mean, I've been really encouraged by seeing so many more young, motivated people getting interested in farming in a way that I don't think would have been the case, you know, even 10 or 20 years ago. But I think we do still have a job on our hands to try and, you know, just get a bit more nuance into the narrative. You know, you so often get this, oh, you want to take us all back to the past, to this rural idyll that never existed. And, you know, that's absolutely not what I think anyone in the movement wants to do. Nevertheless, we can look back to the past and look at people who lived in local, low impact, low energy societies, and many of the solutions that they came up with are ones we can learn from. But, you know, I think we have to sort of let go of this kind of narrative of endless progress and just be open-minded to different solutions from people in different parts of the world or different points in history. You know, that change is coming whether we like it or not, and it's a matter of accentuating the positive and learning what we can, and hopefully harnessing the energy of a lot of young people who are, you know, much more switched on to this than most people in my generation, for sure.
Let's finish up with my last question before we start taking questions from people on the webinar. One of the great joys that I've had since we've been living on the farm is that we've been able to host WWOOFers, which is short for Worldwide Working Opportunities on Organic Farms. And basically what it means is people come stay with you for weeks or months, or in my case, years, and exchange their labour for bed and board and the opportunity to learn about how to farm. And the reason that it's been a great joy, not just because I've met the most wonderful people from all around the world who've exchanged their labour and their curiosity for bed and board, but because they have brought. We've been able to do such lovely things together that we wouldn't otherwise have done. We have sat around campfires till late in the evening. We've eaten, you know, beautifully produced food. We've had, you know, ridiculously raucous parties, you know, in barns and fields, with that kind of joy and energy that is very far removed from the kind of urban experience. And that's something else that you talk about both in your book, Chris, and it's in the Future Generations Act, in the commitment to protecting culture. You talk about how we can, you quote David Fleming and the importance of carnival and celebration to create that sense of joy and connection for the kinds of lives that we can live, that don't necessarily rely on the latest iPad or the latest computer game, but nonetheless is just full of joy. Just say a bit more about what that means to both of you in the context of the work that you do. Chris,
well, I was just thinking about the fact that will I be able to wassail my apple trees in the context of and just all those things about celebrating the seasons and living life according to the seasons. And I think that until you actually engage with the soil in that kind of way, you don't realize that there are real seasons, because if you go into a supermarket, unless you've started to be very careful about what you purchase, as we happen to be, you don't necessarily see where things come from, and they're there all year round. So you don't think about that in the context of what can be produced in your own country. But if I just go back to that tractor at the moment, the one that passes our tractor shed, and you can see it over the top of the tractor shed. Yesterday, the UK Climate Change Commission published its report and demonstrated that actually we'll have to take diesel, i.e. fossil fuels, oil and gas, which includes diesel, out of the system by the 2030s. So it suddenly means that in this decade, we have to think again completely about how we farm. Now, I hope other countries will do similarly, but if the UK government accept that as a proposition, it does give enormous opportunities for us to think about how to promote ideas of small farms and bring more people onto the land than have been there hitherto. But that celebration is partly why I love living where I live, why I love jumping in the sea 3 times a week in the morning and watching the sunrise, and why I miss people so massively in my daily life, because in rural environments, the people you do see are part of your soul. They are your external family. They are the people you learn from, and they're very, very important in keeping us sane and happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, because there's so many different things going on our site, and we're part, I guess, of a little farm community. And when you move beyond the sort of labour cutting diesel nexus, there's just enormous numbers of ways in which people can work together on the land. And and we do things with school kids, for example, who are struggling in the classroom and sort of on the point of being excluded from school, and when they come out and start interacting in a in the landscape, it's kind of like, well, these are supposed to be the naughty kids, it's it's very transforming. I mean, I do look in my book that there are sort of interesting issues where creating culture, there's never just one single culture that everyone can sign up to. There's always kind of dimensions of complexity and potential exclusion, and difficult, creating sort of long-term working relationships with other people around land. There's a whole tradition of creating commons, which sometimes work and sometimes don't, and I sort of try and talk about that a little bit in the book. We are going to need to create new agricultural commons, but they're not a panacea. So I think the larger story is we need to create thriving rural communities. We need to create new culture. There are some difficulties and obstacles along the way, and we need to be kind of alive to the complexities of that. But undoubtedly, there's a lot of pleasure to be had from being on a more labor intensive farm where it's not just you and the tractor.
So we're fast running out of time, and we promised we would take questions, didn't we, in the last 10 minutes, and that's here now. So let's have a little look at some of the the questions that people have been asking in the chat. So some very specific ones around DEFRA policies and whether DEFRA's intention to help farmers retire will go some way to both releasing land and changing the profile of farming. And I think that's definitely possible. It's definitely possible, and it is the intention. I suppose the big risk is whether farmers retiring from the land will open up the space for small farmers to come in or new entrants to come in, or whether, and here's the big risk that I'm afraid of, is that a mass exit from the land opens up the possibility for private finance to come in, buy up land with no relationship to community whatsoever, and to run the land as an asset, benefiting from government support for things like, tree planting and so on. We end up going back to the 1970s and the Sitka spruce plantations. So I think there's opportunity for older farmers to leave farming, but there is not yet any balancing opportunity for new entrants to come in and take up those sorts of opportunities. Tessa asks, is there, do we think there is a way of redistributing land without having necessarily to buy it off landowners? Is there a fair system for redistributing land?
Well, I mean, I think, I talk in my book about sort of inheritance tax. I mean, there's a book like Guy Shrubsole's book, Who Owns England? I mean, we have a massive land concentration. And I think that needs to be tackled, and, interesting stuff going on in Scotland around that, for example. But clearly it's quite politically contentious because it doesn't feel, if you are the possessor of land, it doesn't necessarily feel very fair. And I think, historically we've had quite concentrated land ownership, partly because land ownership in the last couple of hundred years, it hasn't conferred political power, but I think in the future it will do. And so it's really important to unlock access to land, but clearly very contentious. But I think we do need to be thinking in terms of what do people need to thrive through their lives. Do they need more than that? Do they need more land than that? Probably not. So I think we need to have some difficult conversations about land reform and inheritance.
I think whereas I kind of understand that, I'm always somebody who likes to go with the art of the possible. And if we look at the fact that in the UK, and the UK is quite different to other countries in this context, we actually see the largest amount of land ownership has barely shifted since 1066 and Norman conquest. So I'm not sure we're going to be able in the next few years, when we've got to really focus on climate, to shift necessarily the land ownership. But I do think that there are going to be an increasing number of opportunities in the context of land for sale and a retiring generation of farmers. I know that in my own area in North Pembrokeshire, which is a very rural county, that there is something like 1,000 acres for sale at the moment. Now, at the moment, they're for sale in whole farms, but you could see a situation whereby what already happens is other farmers buy them up and then they put cattle or sheep on that land. But they could potentially be bought up and then divided to create other kinds of particularly horticultural opportunities, because Wales grows very little of its own fruit and vegetables. So you could see that there could be some imaginative ways that particularly money that was delivered according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act would deliver some different outcomes. And I think the other thing that we could, I suppose, potentially look at, again, I don't know what the situation is in other parts of the world, in Canada or the US, where we've got a number of people on the call, but what we used to have here were local authority farms, where actually people go and be a practice farmer. And most of those have been sold off. But actually, it may be that if there is an excess of land over opportunity, that actually local authorities could be a vehicle for buying some of that land back to create similar kinds of opportunities. So I think that if we take some things that a few people have said on the chat and the questions, the fact that if we're going to have a really determined decade where politically we tackle the climate issues, we also need to look at all those positive well-being issues alongside that and put that into the political mix in all the countries.
Chris, did you want to? There's another question in the chat, Chris, that talks about renting land and tenant farming, which, you know, in fact, there are many tenant farms in the UK. I think I might be right in saying that 50% of farms are tenanted, aren't they? So the idea that all farmers are wealthy landowners is again somewhat mythical. But do you see any opportunity in creating new models of tenancy, or does that just come with lots of risk?
I think it comes with a certain amount of risk. I mean, it depends on the on what the bigger political structures are. So obviously, I mean, Jane just very correctly mentioned county farms, is a good model. I mean, one of the problems is that, the county farm estate has tended to be run down, and local authorities have, the sort of pound signs have been in their eyes in terms of development land, but that, that could be a positive, stable possibility. I mean, obviously, I do touch in my book on all the debates about the history of the origins of capitalism, and one aspect of that is rental, farm rental, that's kind of pushing people to increase the income from the farm. And so that is a potential difficulty, is that you as a tenant you lose control of the terms of the tenancy. And obviously, again, historically in recent times, I mean, it's not something I know a huge amount about, but there have been perhaps some relatively stable terms of tenancy that have enabled people to farm perfectly adequately. I mean, my fear about it is that it just puts the power in the hands of landlords, who may have longer term community or land interests at heart, but not necessarily. So I totally agree with Jane saying that politics is the art of the possible. So we need to think about all sorts of possible solutions. But personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about landlordism.
And there's a good challenge from Julie Brown in the chat too, saying that my construction of the gig economy as being all bad was a bit under nuanced. I think you said, Julie, that was very kind of you. And that for lots of people, part-time and flexible working is exactly what they need. And I completely agree with you, having lived most of my life in flexible working arrangements in one form or another. But it's autonomy, I think, that matters. It's people being able to have a choice to work in the way that works for them, and to be appropriately rewarded for that work, and not having to give up a decent wage or decent conditions or decent terms and benefits if you're having to work in much more flexible ways. So we've got 2 minutes left, and I just wonder whether we ought to take that minute each for you to perhaps sum up for us, perhaps a couple of calls to arms, calls to action in the times that we're living in now. I said to you right at the start that when we moved to this farm 20 years ago, a lot of people said, what on earth are you wanting to do, buying a farm and living on a farm? It's just flipping hard work. And I said to friends and family at the time, you wait, come the apocalypse, you'll be grateful I did this. And of course, this last year, they're all being extremely grateful that we live where we live and we have those sorts of opportunities. So given that we are looking now at potential scenarios in front of us, which could be pretty apocalyptic, what is your call to arms, your call to action?
Well, I mean, actually, I think Jane's book and the idea of future generations is a really good one, in the sense of, I think there is the danger is, I think, there's a a real pull to sort of close down and to sort of to put up boundaries and kind of say, well, the world is a scary place, so we need to sort of look after our own here. And I mean, I think there's a whole ethical set of problems with that, but also I don't think it's necessarily gonna play well. So I think we need to be open. We need to be open to the fact that there are going to be people coming from urban situations, coming from other countries, and we need to sort of find ways to for people to be able to create thriving livelihoods in these really new and unprecedented situations. And I think a wider sense of handing on a positive legacy to the future generations, and creating that culture, but trying to create it in inclusive ways where, I mean, Jane has this wonderful bit in her book where she talks about new disruptive conversations at the local level about what communities can do for themselves, and it's great if governments like in Wales can enable that. That's what we need to be doing, unlocking land access for all and for future generations, not kind of closing it down and creating boundaries that I think are not going to serve anyone's interests in the long term.
Jane?
I think for me, it is about having a values framework that reflects that we are ancestors to future generations. What we've done previously, if we've sent our problems down to future generations, whether they're nuclear or money, they're going to be paying the cost of COVID when we're not, because our current politicians will not do that. And I think it's absolutely critical that we stop sending our problems down to future generations and we take them on ourselves. And in doing that, we actually make it possible for future generations to live better lives. So I think that for me, they're part of the reason I really wanted to have this debate with Chris is that when at the end of the day, it all comes down to delivery. So although what I've been able to do is create a mechanism for Wales that I really hope will change the dynamic of politics here and is already starting to. And others have asked about whether other countries are interested. Yes, Canada is interested, New Zealand is interested, Iceland's interested, Scotland's interested, parts of Australia are interested. There's lots of interest in countries wanting to do something themselves in their own way. But it's also about what we do individually. So I think that in a farming discussion, there was one call on the food about go plant some food. And I think that is what we should all do today. Go plant some food, do one thing, big thing this coming year that makes you much greener than you were the year before, and design fossil fuels out of your lives, because we're all going to have to do that. And the sooner we do it, the better a chance my new granddaughter of 3 days ago has to have a long and happy life.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just be very quick in my thanks because at the phone zone it's gone. Somebody else has picked it up. That was just magnificent. I knew I would love this conversation and I knew I would find it really, really difficult to stop at the end of it. But we're over and people are dropping off all over the world now, having to go on and live those lives. I just want to thank you both so much for in different but incredibly complementary ways painting a picture that speaks to policy and the conditions that governments can and should create for the sorts of practical propositions that you're describing so brilliantly in your book, Chris. So thank you. I have absolutely loved it and I'm very, very much looking forward to seeing you both in real life before too long.
Well, thanks. It's been great talking with you. So yeah, I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I've certainly learnt a lot.
Thank you very much.